We begin with what could be a big breakthrough in the drive to boost the world's coronavirus vaccine supply. The White House has announced support for waiving vaccine patent protections. Now, the U.S. Trade Representative said that extraordinary measures are needed to end the pandemic. The U.S. has previously resisted efforts at the World Trade Organization to temporarily suspend intellectual property protections on COVID-19 vaccines. It now joins more than 100 countries in supporting the move. Shares of major vaccine makers Moderna and Novavax dipped on the announcement. Let's bring in William Glucroft, who joins us now from DW News. William, tell us, what exactly is U.S. President Joe Biden advocating here?
So he's joining the calls to have a temporary exception to intellectual property rules that govern pharmaceuticals, including vaccines, to allow for a quicker and broader supply to be created all around the world, so generic pharmaceutical companies like in India and Israel and other places can produce the very vaccines, including the mRNA vaccines, without getting permission or having to do deals with Pfizer, with Moderna, these kinds of companies. Now, it should be noted the United States is usually a very strong advocate for intellectual property rights, for patent protections. It's often criticizing China for skirting those rules to protect their own industries and also to protect the incentive for companies to invest in new technologies. But in this case, what Biden has come out and said is the urgency of the pandemic outweighs those economic and technological innovation arguments.
Talk with us about the timing. Why now?
Well, this was a campaign promise that Joe Biden made last year. He said he would support this very kind of temporary lifting or a waiver to the intellectual property rules at the WHO. And he's come under intense pressure from fellow Democrats, from progressive groups, from World Health advocates, trying to get him to do this. And he's basically making good on that campaign promise. Of course, he's had to fight the opposition of the pharmaceutical industry that makes a lot of money off of these patents. It should also be noted they also costs them a lot of money and takes a lot of risk to develop these kinds of treatments. So that's kind of the back and forth. And there's also the diplomacy aspect. For example, China and Russia have been using their vaccines very effectively as a kind of currency, a diplomatic currency in relations with other countries. And the U.S., that's been so successful at vaccinations at home, is under a lot of pressure to show goodwill to help end this pandemic elsewhere, especially in places like India that have been just getting hit so hard by the pandemic. And that is something that advocates of this waiver are hoping will help get more vaccines out into the world, especially lower and middle income countries.
DW's William Glucroft, thank you. So what does all this mean for the business side of things? Let's bring in Chelsea Delaney, who's joining us from Frankfurt. Chelsea, how significant would this be for vaccine makers, this patent waiver?
Well, vaccine makers are obviously very upset by this proposal. We've seen particularly the shares of some of the smaller biotech firms like Moderna and BioNTech get hit really hard on the market. And these are companies that were developing the technology behind these vaccines for years before the pandemic. So for them, they really don't want to give up this technology. We're hearing a lot of different arguments from the pharmaceutical industry. One is that this would discourage companies like BioNTech from wanting to innovate and to invest money into new technologies in the future. The pharmaceutical industry is also arguing that this would really open up this technology to some of the U.S.'s competitors like China and Russia. But also a lot of pharmaceutical companies are saying that this is just not the most effective way to boost vaccine supply for these smaller and poor countries.
Okay, and just to remind our viewers, I mean, this isn't a done deal yet, so it's really just speculation at this point as to whether or not indeed it actually happens. But, tell us, in the meantime, how are manufacturers potentially positioning themselves right now?
Well, this is one of the other arguments against opening up the waiver from the pharmaceutical industry. Making these vaccines is extremely complicated. It's a very difficult scientific procedure, and we've even seen some of the more developed pharmaceutical industries in the U.S., here in Europe, really struggle to get these production lines off the ground. So a lot of people are arguing that even if this procedure goes through, which could take several months, it would be very difficult for some of these smaller, poorer countries to get the supply, the workforce, and the industrial capacity to quickly ramp up the production of these vaccines.
Okay, so many different angles to this story. Chelsea Delaney giving us a view on what the business world is saying. Thank you so much. Here are some other developments in the pandemic. Indonesia is banning travel during the popular homecoming period to celebrate Eid al-Fitr. COVID-19 cases there have been falling, but the government wants to prevent a repeat of last year's mortality rate rise after the holiday. The World Health Organization is planning to set up a global pandemic hub in the German capital, Berlin, to gather and to analyze data on emerging pandemic threats. And Canada has authorized use of the biotech Pfizer vaccine on children as young as 12. It is the first country in the world to approve a vaccine for children.